You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Welcome back. We're now joined by a special guest, former Republican Governor of Illinois, Jim Edgar. Thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
I want to start here. We had the first round of debates earlier this week for the Republican primary. You've weighed in on this race and just what Republicans need to do this election cycle to maybe win back a little bit of power in this building. But I wonder, we're about a month out now from everybody going to the polls for the primary. What are your thoughts so far on the candidates who are running?
Well, they're basically all kind of unknowns. I mean, they have not held statewide office before. One is a state senator, one's a mayor of a second largest city in the state. But for the most part, they're unknown to the voters. I think a lot of this primary will be people trying to get to know them and trying to find out not just so much what they stand for, just what kind of people they are. I'm a great believer in character. It's something that voters ought to look at as much as the issues. Issues change, character doesn't change. So, we have seen the emergence of two that seems like they're running ahead of the rest of the pack. But primaries are really hard to predict. Turnout is so important, and we don't know for sure who's going to turn out. We know not as many people turn out for a primary as a general election. Polling sometimes in a primary can be misleading. The fact in this polling that we've seen, there's a large number of undecided voters, about 25%. So, anything could happen, though I do think it appears it's down to the two candidates, Richard Irving, the mayor of Aurora, and Mr. Bailey, the senator from Effingham, state senator. It seems like it's between those two who can win this race, and they're very different people. So the voters, I think, have got to figure out not only who do they like, but I think they also have to take consideration in a primary. You try to make sure hopefully you nominate a candidate who can win in the fall. And again, it's kind of an unknown. They're all unknown, and to some extent we have not seen them run statewide before. But I think looking at the candidates right now, that at least the two top candidates, I think that Irving probably has the best chance of being successful in the fall more than Bailey. Now, he may not be, and Bailey might do better than I would think. But my take on it, just because his experience of a mayor of a large city in the state, the fact that he is someone in a suburban area, which there's a lot of, I think, undecided votes there, that would, I think, be more probably a stronger candidate than someone from downstate. I think some of Senator Bailey's comments about Chicago, while no Republican's going to carry Chicago, you want to get some votes out of Chicago. So again, I think probably going into the general election, Irving would be the strongest. Now that doesn't mean he'll win the primary, even though he's ahead in the polls, but I think that would be one factor for people to take into consideration when they're voting. There's no doubt on issues. Bailey might be a little more clearly, he is definitely right of center, and a lot of those issues are important to people who vote in Republican primaries. And if he does get a late surge, I think it'll be because of his ideology. If Irving wins those undecided voters, I think it'll be because of his experience as mayor and the fact that he probably is the strongest candidate in the fall.
I wonder, I can't remember exactly when you said this, but in a Chicago Sun-Times article, you had talked about Republicans' chances going into November, and one of the key pieces of advice you gave was that they can't scare the suburbs, was what you said. And I reading into that more, you were talking about, some of those more hardcore conservative ideas that, may gain you a lot of support in downstate, but may not gain the favor of a lot of, families in the suburbs. We're seeing a lot of these candidates, even the ones that, aren't front runners right now, but a lot of the candidates are really fighting for this position of who's the most conservative in this primary. And how does that affect chances for a candidate in November when, maybe they go really far to win the Republican primary, but then they kind of have to scale back to have a chance in November?
Well, I think it makes it very difficult if they go far right. particularly in a state like Illinois, to win in a general election. And I'd caution everyone, and I've cautioned some of the candidates, just to be careful on what you do say. Now, don't say something you don't believe, but don't feel like you have to go that far. I think part of the dilemma, especially those candidates who are behind, they're trying to get some votes. And so they're undoubtedly kind of susceptible to the pressure to go to the far right and to say things that maybe they wouldn't say otherwise. But you should be careful on that, because in the end, what good's it going to do to win the primary and get killed in the general election? And if you move too far to the right, just for winning the primary. Now, if you believe that, again, I think people ought to say what they believe. But I don't think they ought to try to move so far to the right that it will damage them in the general election. And again, I think, all the candidates definitely are trying to position themselves right of center. But I think, again, some I think are better positioned to go into the general election than others will be.
It's something that's been really interesting about the past couple of months in particular is Richard Irvin, who is widely considered to be the front runner in this race, has really neglected to take a hard stance on some pretty key issues. Most recently, when the Supreme Court's leaked ruling on Roe v. Wade came out, he refused to give a stance at all, saying it would be irresponsible to comment on a leaked draft like that. Now, reporters have pressed him repeatedly, saying there are a lot of people that are questioning, if their health care is going to be there, their access is going to be there, and this is a key issue going into this election cycle. That's just one of a few different issues that he's kind of avoided. Is it fair for a candidate to avoid giving his stances on something like this and try to kick the can down the road until November, when he maybe doesn't have to, when he knows he's going to be on the opposite side of the political spectrum from his opponent?
Well, I think one of his arguments was until there's an official ruling. He's a lawyer, so that's kind of a lawyer answer. Again, there's some issues that people may not have completely got in their mind exactly where they are. I think, though, it'd be far better that he doesn't answer the question than he answers the question, then he changes his mind 3 months from now in the general election. If people don't get the answer in the primary, I think they'll get an answer in the general election. It's a fine line. I mean, it's a difficult thing to try to, again, position yourself in a primary, but also not damage yourself for the general election. And, I think to some extent that might be what he's doing. And some of the other candidates maybe figure, they don't have a choice. They've got to go way far to the right to try to win the primary. But I think that could damage them in the general election.
What are your thoughts on him avoiding a direct answer on whether he voted for President Trump in 2016 or 2020? He says his answer to did you vote for Trump now is always, I'm a Republican, I always vote Republican in generals, but he won't say I voted for President Trump.
Well, I would say I've been asked, and sometimes I say it's a secret ballot. I'm not going to tell you how I voted.
But you're not in office anymore.
What about, I'm not sure, being in office or even running for office, you've got to tell everybody you voted for. And I'm not sure that's that big of an issue here. I think you get into asking more legitimate is, if he doesn't answer on some of the issues, but how he voted in a past election. There are people I voted for that I'd be embarrassed to say I voted for today. So I can understand why people might be hesitant. And also the other thing is, there's a little bit of a laziness out there on the part of the media. They always want to talk about Trump. I don't think he's on the ballot here. I don't think we're not a national election. We're talking about state elections. So I think that maybe we spend too much time, are you for or against Trump? Then, talking about the issues or talking about the person's record, what has he done? So I'm not that upset that he doesn't answer that question. Again, it is a secret ballot, and I guess because I've used that a few times myself, saying it's a secret ballot.
Do you feel like the definition of conservative has changed from when you were in office to now?
Yeah, well, the Republican Party has changed. Unfortunately, I think it's moved. Now, in Illinois, not as bad as in nationwide, but I think the party has definitely moved far to the right. And I just think, setting aside the issues, whether they're right or wrong, politically, I think that's very detrimental to the party long term. Because while I don't think the people are moving far to the left, like the Democrats have to worry that they move too far to the left, and I think that's their big fear. But I think most people are still in the middle. And I don't think it serves either party well to move either far right or far left. I think most voters would like to have people in the middle, and I think they would like to have people who may disagree, but they're willing also to sit down and negotiate and come up with a compromise. And unfortunately, the fringes of both parties are less likely to do that than people who are in the center. So I think most people would like to see both parties be more in the center than they have been. But the Republican Party is different than it was, 30 years ago, 32 years ago when I first got elected governor. Many of the people have moved into independents, some have moved to Democrats. We have some Republicans now who were Democrats. When I ran for governor 30 years ago, downstate was swing. Suburbs, very Republican, the city, very Democrat. But the downstate would swing, and however downstate went, it's pretty much how the election went. Well, that's changed. Today, downstate's probably 20% Republican. I mean, I always said a bad candidate on the Republican ticket could carry downstate by 10%. That's a change, because we've seen a lot of Democrats in the southern part of the state who are actually more conservative than the Republicans were in the community where I grew up. They've now become Republicans. And that's Republicans win downstate. But unfortunately, downstate is less than a third of the state's population. The suburbs, which used to be heavily Republican, have now moved where it's swing. And that's where the most people are in the state. So that's a problem for the party. I think long term that if we continue to move to the right, I'm not sure how viable we're going to be down the road. And I think it's extremely important. We have a strong two-party system. I'm a great believer in the two-party system. And so both parties have got to be viable. And right now, I think the Democrats have too much power in many ways. But the Republicans have got to figure out a way to become more viable. And I think they've got to move back to the center. That's where it was when Jim Thompson and myself won elections. It's when we controlled the legislature, because we were more of a moderate party than we are today.
I want to get part of this election cycle, one of the weirder parts that we've seen kind of kick in, or more interesting parts, I guess. Governor Pritzker has kind of gotten involved in this Republican primary this past week. I don't know if you've seen it yet.
Yeah,
but
I heard.
Yeah, he had a TV ad air going at Richard Irvin. And, Irvin still, got a month before we even know if he's going to have the primary bid yet. The Democratic Governors Association aired several ads painting Bailey as the hardcore conservative and trying to paint it in a negative light, but also putting Bailey in that conservative spotlight for a lot of downstate voters. A lot of people thought that was Pritzker trying to, support Bailey, get Bailey to November. Okay,
it's clearly the Pritzker people, the Democrats, think, and I think they're right, that Irvin's the toughest candidate to run against Pritzker in the fall. So they're going to do everything they can to knock him out now and not have to face who they think is the toughest candidate.
What do you think about a sitting governor, getting involved in the primary in that way?
Well, that's just right, but I think it sends a message to Republicans that it's obvious the Democrats think that Irvin's the strongest candidate. In some ways, I think that can backfire on Bailey and the other candidates because Republicans are going to say, wait a minute, if they're trying to knock out Irvin, they must think he's the strongest candidate, which I think that's the reason they're doing it. There's no other good reason for them to be in there spending that money. It's not the first time that's happened, but I think it does underscore the perception that I think exists among most political experts that Irvin is the strongest candidate to run against Pritzker, at least who's in the primary. And that's why you're seeing the Democratic money coming in trying to beat him in the primary. It's probably a lot cheaper if they can knock him off now than what they're going to have to spend to try to beat him in the fall. But for Irvin, I know their people are, gee, we're getting beat up on this. Well, you're getting beat up, but make lemonade out of lemon. Point out that, as they did in, I think, their last commercial, hey, it's obvious that Pritzker's worried about me. That's why they're spending this money. And that, I think, is a pretty good message to send to Republican primary voters.
I want to shift topics because we had obviously earlier this week another mass shooting in America, this time in Uvalde, Texas, a school shooting, 19 students dead, 2 teachers dead. President Biden earlier this week revamped calls for an assault rifle ban. Now, kind of deja vu with that situation because we know back in the 90s, in the middle of your term as governor, Bill Clinton had a nationwide assault rifle ban for 10 years. And I want to talk with you, how do you see the debate around guns in America now compared to what it was in the 90s? Has it changed much?
Well, it's changed from the point of view that we've seen so many innocent lives taken because we have not acted. And I totally agree with President Biden. You know, when are the elected officials going to get a backbone and stand up to the gun lobby? I mean, there's no reason in the world for people to run around with assault weapons. I'm a great believer in allowing the hunters to hunt. You can have your weapons to hunt. You don't need assault weapons. You don't need a weapon that's going to shoot 50 bullets in a minute, and that's what they've been using to kill these children with. And they wouldn't have been able to. And they might have got some guns, but they wouldn't have been able to get ones that are so easy to kill so quickly if we had a ban on assault weapons. I mean, during that period when the Clinton ban was in, because we tried to do some things here in Illinois, then the president came along and did that. For 10 years, there were less shootings with weapons. Now, that didn't eliminate all the shootings, and that's, again, something I think we need to look at. But at the background check, in fact, we're supposed to have it in Illinois, but unfortunately, we don't have the resources put in to do the checks we should. We need to put more of an emphasis on that. But I think that's just common sense. You know, people are going to get a gun. That's a lethal weapon. They ought to be able to, we ought to know that there's not a mental problem with these people. And also, I don't think there's any need for the average citizen to carry an assault weapon. That's just, I think, is common sense. But unfortunately, and particularly in primaries, in the Republican Party, the NRA and gun people, and there's a lot of folks out there that have been convinced by the NRA that if they take our assault weapons, they're coming after our shotguns next. And I have always argued, take the assault weapons away and you can keep they won't come after you for the other things. But if you don't, someday you could have a complete reversal and take everything away. And I think that would be wrong too, because I do think people ought to have some weapons to protect themselves, but they don't need an assault weapon. And I also think we ought to be assured as a public that people do have guns, that they are, as well as we can determine, mentally stable. They don't have a record of erratic behavior. And, selling the bullets. I mean, Texas has terrible laws when it comes to trying to protect the public from gun violence. And, some 18-year-old walking in, buying an assault weapon and getting all those bullets, I mean, you'd think that would raise some question, particularly if he came in the next week and bought another one. I mean, I just think we have too many people have convinced themselves that you can't put any restrictions on guns, and I think common sense says we have to, or we're going to continue to. I mean, after Sandy Hook, I really thought this would be the time, and nothing happened. And nothing's happened to this point. I hope something will happen, but I'm not optimistic that, unfortunately, my party is going to start to realize they've got to move on this issue. Or again, it's one of those issues that long term is going to, I think, be the demise of the Republican Party.
You just this week, we've talked with a few different politicians about this, and just for the sake of, I guess, fairness, we'll talk about the race right now for the Illinois 15th Congressional District. It's Rodney Davis and Mary Miller running against each other. We've heard from both of those candidates. Mary Miller, in her statement sent to us, criticized President Biden for, later that day after the shooting happened, making the speech political. That was the part she hung on in this whole debate. Rodney Davis talked about all of the different things that they could try to protect schools without restricting the Second Amendment rights of people in America, but did not want to support any of the gun laws that are being proposed right now, saying that they would be too intrusive. Using those two candidates as an example in a Republican primary in downstate, when you hear those comments and that's the response to 19 children dying in a school, what does that tell you about your party?
Well, it disappoints me. I mean, I understand the politics, and they're in a primary, and this is a big issue in the primary, and they're both trying to out-conservative the other one on this issue. But I think it's unfortunate because, again, we can put guards around the school. I don't think that's going to protect. I mean, if you don't take away the ability for people to get the weapons that come in and do the damage, and also even if you, let's say that protected the schools, if we like the background checks, that's still not going to protect people walking down the street. I mean, there's a lot of other places, like the grocery store in Buffalo, where somebody came in and just started shooting because people were black. I mean, we've got a lot of sick people out there, and unfortunately they're able to get a hold of guns and they can get a hold of assault weapons. So I think I disagree with both of them on this issue. As far as being political, I mean, good heavens. I think President Biden said what most people were thinking. And I don't think you say, we're not going to talk about this because it wouldn't be right, politicizing it. I think by doing nothing, you've politicized it. And that's, unfortunately, is what happened in the last 20 years, and particularly in the last 10 years since Sandy Hook, which I just think is there's no way you can justify that. And again, you can protect people's right to have weapons that they need to be able to hunt, protect that right, without allowing people that shouldn't have assault weapons running around and murdering young children.
You talked about growing a backbone against the gun lobby, echoing what President Biden said in that speech. Is that, how do you see that compared to, from now compared to the 90s, the gun lobby's power and how that's all kind of works? Well, was that a consistent wall?
Yeah, it was strong then. I think the fact, though, then we didn't have all these children being murdered in schools because they hadn't acted, because the gun lobby was able to stop all this legislation. And I think that's what makes it even more unacceptable today. You know, if nobody had been killed, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion. But the fact this happens over and over again. And, you know, innocent children are being, I just can't imagine how anyone could hide behind the Second Amendment to justify this, to allow this to happen. I mean, again, you can do what I think the original intention was, and people can still have weapons. They can still hunt. They can still protect themselves in their homes, but they shouldn't be able to take an assault weapon, anybody, and go out there and shoot people. And unfortunately, I don't know if you can put enough guards around schools to completely prevent that. And I don't think you can prevent that at every grocery store in America and every place that people gather. I think you've got to get at the root cause, and the root cause of that is a gun. And in some cases, people are unbalanced, so we've got to deal with both those issues. So on this issue, I think I split, and I've always split with a lot of the Republicans on this issue. I just think we have to do something about assault weapons. And I think we need to have background checks. And we should have had it 20 years ago, definitely 10 years ago. And I just think it's a failure of government that, and it's basically lays at one party. I mean, there's Democrats who will vote that way too, and they're afraid of that issue in some ways. But we need to see some movement among Republicans on this issue to deal with it. So we shouldn't have to keep having these discussions after a mass killing. No other country has this. I mean, it's not like this is common. This is because America, we have such lax laws on who can have guns and what kind of guns they can have. And it's just, I think, is unfortunate.
Governor Edgar, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be right back.